The previous two videos in this series were intended to teach the defensive half of fighting games, minimizing risk and the damage you take. But the reason these videos came first is because to understand offense, you need to understand first how your opponent's thinking about their defense. If you want to be able to combo your opponents into oblivion and wipe their health bars down in seconds, the prime skill you're going to have to learn in order to break through their guard is known as mixing up the opponent. So what exactly is that? A mix-up is, simply put, a situation where you force your opponent to guess between multiple options. They have to either predict your attack successfully or they're going to get hit. The most common type of mix-up is this subdivision, a 50-50. A situation where there's exactly two options to choose from and your opponent has to make the choice from either of them. These can be left-right, high-low, or strike-throw. Some characters have these mix-ups built into their moveset. Anji has an overhead or a low that he can enter from his stance. Leo can either run through you or stay put, and after a blocked spin, Nagoriyuki can go for his command grab or an attack. Other characters and other games come to situations where these are guesses you have to make a lot more organically. In Street Fighter, if an opponent is knocked down, they have to guess if you're going to throw them when they stand up or attack them. In Under Night, the assault system is a very low to the ground dash and jump combination move that forces the opponent to let your character begin pressuring them if it's blocked. And as that description might betray, other fighting games might force you into this kind of situation after you block an opponent's jumping attack. Almost always these situations arise from some sort of situation where you are at the advantage. Whether it's because you've hit the opponent successfully, you've forced them to block an attack of yours that can't be punished, or you've knocked your opponent to the ground after a combo. After you've done something correct and you're at an advantage over your opponent, then you're free to start attempting to confuse and mess with your opponent to break their guard, hence the term mix-up. Let's look at 3 different situations where I'm going to force my opponent to block each of these types of mix-up in a few different fighting games, and I'm going to display differences between a good mix-up and a bad mix-up. In this first situation, I do a simple set of attacks, light, medium, and then low medium, but all 3 of these are blocked, and I'm going to follow this up with Dragon Ball's universal overhead attack. But as you can see, this is quite slow. It takes 24 frames for every character to start up this universal overhead, so it's almost half a second. FYI, the number of startup frames that start being considered reactable for moves is roughly 17 frames, so 24 is quite long in this sense. As a result, this particular sequence could be seen as a bad mix-up. It's slow enough to not only be reacted to, but you can be punished out of it. In fact, if I do the same combo but I call in an assist during the low kick, not only does it make this mix-up safe, it adds more noise to the screen and makes it harder for the opponent to react. That turns this mix-up from a bad one to a good one. Great job, Lord Cooler. Next, for Guilty Gear Strive, Leo's run through attack. If I do a sequence like this, I can end it with either the run through or his run forward attack. If I set the opponent to grab the instant they're not blocking anymore, in this scenario he manages to block, and in this scenario Leo gets grabbed, so in both scenarios Leo's lost. I can actually fix this however just by changing the moves I do beforehand. If I do the exact same sequence but I just start with low kick, the opponent doesn't have this gap in which to grab me and instead now has to correctly guess if I attack from the front or the rear. Finally, for strike throw, this one runs into the opposite problem. If I perform a combo like this, Nagoriyuki can't throw the opponent, but the strike works. This happens because of block stun, which is the official term for the numbers that are causing the reds and blues that happened in the previous video. Those reds and blues are intended as visual representations of frame advantage, the number of frames that your character is in the lead by. If your character recovers from a move faster than your opponent stops being in block stun, then you have frame advantage, and in most games you can't be grabbed out of block stun. Most. This is why Nagoriyuki's strike throw mix-up doesn't work in this case. To have a true mix-up in this scenario, Nagoriyuki needs to use a move with low frame advantage so that the duration of a character's grab is higher than your character's frame advantage value. This move, Nagoriyuki's spin, has plus or minus 0 frame advantage, and his grab special move takes 4 frames to start up. Well below the reactable value that was mentioned earlier, 17 frames. So that turns a bad mix-up, where there is no strike or throw to be had, into a good one. One common thread between each of these types of mix-up that I'm sure you've already noticed is being airtight, so let's talk about that. Eventually you're going to have to know the deep down of those numbers for each of your characters that you play, but those numbers are, as mentioned before, frame data. Besides knowing all of that data though, there's 4 or so different ways that moves can link into each other, and just knowing that can determine how to make something airtight. These 4 types are non-cancels, target combos, special cancels, and dash or jump cancelling. Non-cancels are the most basic type of airtight strings of attacks. They're not very common in modern fighting games, but they're very easily displayed in Tekken. Tekken doesn't really have traditional special moves, so people just get hit or they stay in block stun as long as you keep hitting them with something that's within the duration of the hit stun or the block stun of the previous attack. Of course, the attacks need to actually hit the opponent too, so this doesn't go for low attacks. But for example, if I just fling the enemy into the air, then until they fall to the ground, I get to continue attacking them with whatever attacks manage to hit them. Similarly with blocking, if the opponent keeps blocking me, then they have until they've dropped their guard for me to continue making them block. Visual aids for this aren't the best in fighting games, but my favourite is in BlazBlue. In BlazBlue's training mode, there's a green bar that shows the duration an opponent is in hit stun for. It's a very easy visual indicator for how you can chain things together without knowing all of this frame data. But finding out what does and doesn't work this way takes a lot of experimentation, time, and research, which thankfully the next example does not. Target combos have 3 major variants. Target combos are the system's name in Street Fighter and King of Fighters. Strings are the name for this in Tekken, and Gatling is an umbrella term for anime games, but depending on the game you play, it can be called revolver action, passing link, beat, etc. Many names. But Gatling has become a sort of umbrella term that's synonymous with this system in anime fighting games. Basically, target combos are combos that the game forces to work, even if they wouldn't normally connect because of the move's frame data. A target combo in Street Fighter or King of Fighters is generally just 1 or 2 moves chained together. Strings are very similar to this, but they're lengthened a fair amount. In anime games, Gatlings are your A into B or C, or your light, medium, strong rule. In Guilty Gear Xrd, the game this system gets its namesake from, this rule is punch into kick into slash into heavy slash. But in Guilty Gear Strive, this was adjusted to be a lot more similar to a Street Fighter target combo. Annoyingly, the game itself doesn't actually tell you the majority of these links on a move list anywhere, or explain the connections between these reduced Gatling. But using an external resource like Dustloop, we're able to follow a basic pipeline for putting a blockstring or combo together. So let's try an example. For Kai, one can do close slash into far slash into heavy slash, and as it says, this is good for cancelling into stun edge. 236S. So, before we look at the next 2 examples, special and move cancelling, what is cancelling exactly? There are 3 parts to any move in a fighting game: startup, active frames, and recovery. The startup of an attack is fairly obvious. It's the period of time before an attack starts. Think of it like winding up a punch, or the time before your fist hits your opponent's face. Then comes active frames, the most obvious and understandable version of which is a character with a sword. When the sword is being swung, the attack is active. The opponent can be hit by any of these active attack frames, which will then initiate either block stun or hit stun depending on what the opponent did in response. And then, once the active frames are over, you enter recovery, which is a period of time after your attacks hit an opponent, as you return back to your character's idle state. For example, when your fist leaves your opponent's face and you return back to your stance in boxing. We already talked about non-cancel normals, but the reason Gatlings and target combos work is that they are hard-coded attacks that skip either the startup of the second move, the recovery of the first move, or parts of both, which generally make this look like a seamless series of attacks. Whether this is a 1, 2, 3, 4 or a light, medium, heavy Gatling, that's how these systems work. And similarly, this is what a special cancel is, and how either combo enders or combo extenders are performed. You do a sequence of attacks, whether they're non-cancels, strings, Gatlings, or whatever, and then you just perform a special move's input where the previous move is being performed on screen. Your character will stop their previous move early and begin the new one, the special move you input. The last 2 cancel types I'd mentioned work both for combos, block strings, or even safety. Dash cancelling lets you end a move's recovery early with a dash, which allows you to either chase an opponent across a screen when you've launched them into the air, or create distance during a failing block string to prevent an incoming punish. The same goes for jump cancelling. That will allow air combos to work, and they're crucial for juggles in anime games, the act of joining your opponent in the air after you've launched them during a combo and continuing it. Similarly, you can just jump away from an opponent and prevent them from punishing you before your attack ends. Knowing all these types of cancels essentially allows you to begin performing combos, block strings, and mix-ups. So let's talk about those, starting with block strings, and you can really start your journey to becoming an intermediate player. This is often a tiring subject for beginners, but safety truly is of prime importance, and even after 2 full videos explaining that concept, I'm nowhere near done with all I have to say on the matter. Block strings aren't so much a thing in King of Fighters and Street Fighter, and they also largely take a backseat in Tekken, to make the focuses in those games much more on just general safety and risk reward. But block strings are basically sequences I showed earlier, with attacks that reward the player with mix-ups. Some characters' block strings don't exist for the purpose of mix-ups at all, and are instead just ways to prevent your opponent from punishing you after they block an unsafe moves. But other characters in fighting games can use things like status effects, mix-up forcing moves, projectiles, or even just calling for backup to force you to continue blocking them and make some kind of guess. Block strings are in many ways even more adaptable than combos, and are a main source of conditioning, which is the way you make an opponent guess incorrectly during mix-ups. Whether you're making them think you're going for a strike on every single strike versus throw mix-up, or you're defaulting to low attacks to make them wary of incoming overheads, block strings are the main way you feed data to your opponent and confuse them into guessing wrong. They're a major part of the mind game of fighting games, so definitely don't overlook them when you're learning a character or even amidst your matches. There are actually many expert techniques and intermediate ones to do with block strings and conditioning as well, but we can go over them later. So now for mix-ups. Mix-ups are all about living in your opponent's head. You need to know what they think about you, and you need to make such good, educated guesses that your opponent is still going to think about them when they go to bed that night. The main key isn't just to not be predictable. Sometimes it's about being so predictable your opponent would have to be from another planet to not know what you're going to do next. After all, there's no way you would grab me 3 times in a row, would you? That one still works on pros, in case you were wondering. There's no right way to mix someone up. Sometimes it's a mix-up to just do nothing. There's an overhanging mind game that supersedes everything else going on in a fighting game. Guesses are made based on what your opponent is saying to you through their actions and your interpretation of them. Whether if, through the language of fighting games, they're telling you their true intent, or they're misleading you to make you choose the wrong move. Some people are better at this than others, and thankfully some characters in some games almost completely ignore this concept of mixing up the opponent in favour of purely reacting to your opponent's plays or following a flowchart written by a toddler. But it's important to remember there's always some kind of mind game underlying fighting games, and sometimes making such a good read of the opponent's intent turns what could be a risky move that could lead to your death if blocked into a certainty. Just don't blame me when you guess wrong, it's gonna happen to all of us. Now, combos definitely seem like the most important, the biggest, the most complicated and difficult part to execute of any fighting game when you're an outsider. But really, everything I just taught you in this video has more than prepared you for combos. I'm sure a lot of you have heard combos were an accident and not an intentional piece of design, but that's actually because move cancelling in its entirety was not an intentional mechanic. If you understand move cancelling, you understand combos, and understanding how to make combos is actually only really about understanding what moves can be cancelled into what, and then balancing the input difficulty with your own level of skill and efficiency. If you find one combo hard, there's almost always an easier route to take. Expert combos can be for a lot of purposes: damage, stun, repositioning, knocking down, standing up, building meter, etc. And you can look at and focus on improving any of those things with any character and any combo fairly easily. It might take a bit of flowcharting out what you can do from each button and figuring out your combo starters, or you might need to just do some experimentation on your own. But once you understand the cancels your character can perform, you're well on the way to understanding their combos. Looking at combo trial modes for games is generally what beginners find to be the single most intimidating part of fighting games. But as you can see now, this isn't just an overly specific random set of inputs. Combos are almost always just a list of long cancelable moves. We can see if I try the same combo here with the wrong starter, I can't follow the same route. It might be obvious when it comes to things like juggles and launching an opponent into the air versus a ground combo, but knowing combo routes severely cuts down the amount of trial and error or learning you're going to need to do to understand any combo. They aren't just loaded with random directions and buttons, those are inputs for specific moves. It's not like you can just chain any attack from any normal attack. Leo's crouching heavy slash doesn't link directly into his run forward, even though it will reward you with either version of his back turn stance. Learning these kind of intricacies will make playing correctly much easier, and it'll sometimes even allow you to come up with combos on the fly. Maybe you accidentally anti-air someone with a standing kick, and that kick is jump cancelable, so you can follow the opponent upwards for an improvised combo. You'll notice your play will become a lot more adaptive, you'll be getting a lot more damage off of mostly every single hit you get in any fighting game. Cancelability is huge, and performing cancels is actually very easy. We're going to go over the different types of cancels at a later date, but for now I want to talk about a strong way to use the understanding you built up over these videos, and there's one final skill that you can mix into your gameplay in order to let you graduate from a beginner to an intermediate player, and that would be frame traps. Frame trapping is using your move's advantage or disadvantage when blocked in order to catch out opponents who are too eager to punish you. Anyone who saw the previous video might know that doing a simple block string like A, B, C in Under Night just leaves you open to opponents who are eager to punish and fish for combos. Appropriately enough, people attempting to hit you quickly out of block strings are performing what's called mashing. They're trying to press a button as fast as they can to interrupt your offense and start their own. Frame traps are simply put just using your knowledge of frame data of your moves to lay traps for mashing opponents and cause them to take a hit. Frame traps are technically a kind of block string and a kind of mix-up, even though they aren't airtight and they aren't about left-right, high-low or strike-throw as was discussed earlier. Frame traps come in two kinds, built-in and delayed, and they're fairly easy to explain. So let's look at those and finally wrap this video up. In the video on red versus blue, I mentioned transparent red and transparent blue moves as being safe, but with alternate uses. These moves are useful for frame traps, the trick being that the frame advantage or disadvantage they offer is very weak relative to other moves, generally in a range between +3 and -3, which allow you to do the same attack again, a slightly slower attack, or a slightly faster attack after recovering, with the idea being that if your opponent attempts to mash out of your pressure, they get hit and the frame trap can be converted into a combo. If you look at the frame trap king here, Vegito, he has many built-in frame traps. If I set the opponent to mash light, watch how many times Frieza winds up getting hit for trying to attack.
Right. You work. You work. You work. Right. You work. Right. Right. You work.
The thing that groups this in with all other types of sequence I've talked about in this video is that they're all just that, sequences. Once you know your character, their frame data, and their cancels, you can freely move between all these sequence types and turn your offense into something very scary immediately. Freely floating between safe block strings, mix-ups, frame traps, and combos allows you to keep up a very continuous and very strong offense. With strong enough conditioning, you can turn yourself into one of those players you were losing online games to within 15 seconds just a few weeks ago. The main thing is just to focus on learning and remembering what moves can be cancelled and how. Once you understand that, you're a good enough player to go from beginner to intermediate and finally start winning games and climbing ranks. That's all for this video, and that's the end of the beginner playlist. I know it was a lot of info, but I did my best to streamline all of these related concepts in a way that made sense, in a way that reflects my own learning experience with fighting games. The intermediate playlist will be an ongoing thing that's a lot longer and a lot more specific than the beginner playlist. Fighting games are incredibly deep. New strategies for overall play and individual games and characters are invented all the time. I'm looking to cover some Persona 4 Arena stuff upon its release, and some general anime game strategy that should help a lot if you're interested in playing that. And you should be, it's only 25 quid, and the new balancing added to characters is a really big deal. It's basically a new game that's never been released before. Before I go, I'm going to ask you to leave a like, subscribe to my channel. It really does help, and if you have any topics you want me to cover or any feedback on these videos, just leave them in the comments below. And until next time, stay safe.